Needless to say, humans are really good at learning language very early on in life. In fact, we tend to hit these developmental and language associated milestones so consistently that some people even argue that our ability to acquire language is genetic or innate. We'll come back to that theory in just a moment, but if these milestones, if these sort of stopping points or abilities are are that reliable and also this important in our development, then maybe we should take a minute and talk about them. So, we're going to look at just sort of some of the basic developmental stages, approximate time frames, and what those milestones are. So, from very young age, between birth and 3 months of age, infants will have vocalizations that are initially fairly similar across languages. So, they'll produce all possible phonemes. So, all of the possible sounds, not just the sounds that are produced in the language that their parents speak. They'll also gurgle and they'll respond or orient, turn towards sounds that they hear. By the time they're 6 months old, those babbling sounds begin to sound more like the infant's surrounding language, meaning the language that's spoken around them. So they'll stop producing those phonemes that are sort of universal and made by all languages and stick to just those that are relevant for the language that they're exposed to. They also tend to respond to their name. They're going to continue with the babbling and crying, and they start emitting specific vowel and consonant sounds. By the time an infant is about a year old, they typically have spoken their first word, usually mama or dada, one of those repetitive, easy to learn ones, and this seems to be similar across cultures regardless of the language being spoken. It may be interesting for you to note that while children typically don't speak very much, they don't have a lot of expressive language at that stage, the research is starting to indicate that very young children may actually understand a lot more than they can produce. So they might have a better receptive language or understanding of language than they can express, which is pretty interesting to note. Then if we look at our next milestone, once we get up to that 18 months or so, this is when we start seeing copying of gestures and children start to specialize for their native language. They'll even respond to gestures. And this is where we start seeing that first sort of growth or dramatic change in how many new words they learn. So they go from sort of sporadic single words that are being used to starting to learn many, many words. And then accelerates when we get to our next milestone in that 2 to 3 year mark, which is when they start using shorter sentences. They can start matching objects to the names that are associated with them. They can follow instructions, which shows that they have some understanding of meaning. And so by the time by the time the average child reaches first grade, they'll have a vocabulary of approximately 10,000 words. And by the time they hit fifth grade, they're going to have 4 times that amount. So we start seeing by 2 years old, they can learn as many as 20 new words a week. So this is fairly explosive growth. And this is, again, one of those reasons why we think that there might be something genetic underlying our ability to acquire language, because we learn so much so quickly, and that can't be explained necessarily just by our surroundings, just by our environment. And that sentiment is actually a pretty good way to transition to our next couple of slides, where we actually discuss some of the different theories of language. The first of these is Skinner's environmental theory of language. Now, if you remember back to Psych 104, when we talked about learning, you might have heard of Skinner as being a radical behaviorist. So B.F. Skinner was a major figure in psychology, and he was especially known for championing the study of observable behaviors. So as a radical behaviorist, he focused on studying external forces that affect our behavior. So he didn't like the idea of there being cognitive factors or internal forces that might influence our behavior. He instead focused on the idea that everything that we do is controlled by our interactions with the environment. And so, with that perspective, he urged other psychological scientists to objectively study the human mind by focusing only on that external behavior. So, only on things that are directly observable and, by nature of being observable, therefore measurable. So he viewed language as a verbal behavior, something external that we could observe and measure. So if you remember some of our ideas from discussing operant conditioning back in 104, then you might recall that behaviors that are reinforced tend to be more likely to occur in the future, and behaviors that are punished are less likely to occur in the future. And so, if we focus on language as a verbal behavior, then we can say that the reinforcement and punishment of different verbal behavior can sort of control what we do more of versus what we do less of. So, here, reinforcement and punishment can be mediated by another person. Usually, this would be the child's parents. So if a child asks to have a snack and they receive a snack, then they are more likely to ask for a snack again in the future. If they don't ask politely, or if they don't say it in the right way, or if what they say doesn't make sense, then they're not likely to get what they want. And if it is not reinforced, then that behavior, that incorrect forming of the statement or whatever was wrong with it, is a lot less likely to happen again in the future. And we can even have punishment where if, say, a child is scolded for using a particular word or speaking in a certain tone, then they might be less likely to use that tone or word again in the future. Though interestingly, the textbook takes a moment to note here that depending on how deeply you study language how deeply you study learning, and specifically reinforcement and punishment, it might be worthwhile to note that punishment might not be the best way to get children not to say things they're not supposed to say. There are other factors that go on behind the scenes that can actually make punishment rewarding. So that's just sort of a little caveat that you might want to keep in mind should you be using reinforcement and punishment as a method of shaping language in children. So this theory seems pretty fanatical. It is a radical behaviorist theory, after all, where we're saying that language comes entirely from the positive reinforcement of saying the right thing, and then either not reinforcing or even punishing saying the wrong thing. So is that the only thing that's going on, or is language actually part of is learning part of how we learn language? And the answer seems to be that there is at least some evidence for this theory. There's actually quite a bit of evidence that support this theory. So there's a bunch of cases. We'll talk about just a couple of the really clearly illustrated ones. So, a study done in 2006 by Fernald and Hurtado. The names aren't specifically important, they're just here as references. They instructed caretakers to use particular speech patterns in order to try and improve word recognition in 18-month-olds. sounds. And they did find that using some speech patterns can improve recognition, while using other speech patterns did not improve recognition. So adjusting how caretakers interact with their children can actually affect how much they recognize and then how much they learn about those words. We can also see that in children who were trained how to speak to their mothers of children who stutter, when these mothers were trained on how to adjust their rate of speech in order to make their own speech sort of slower and clearer, there was actually a decrease in their children stuttering. So these children adjusted their own speech patterns to match their parents' speech patterns, and it improved their stuttering. So we see an improvement or an increase in that desired behavior, the not stuttering, as the children were following their parents' lead. Another one is that if parents give encouragement, praise, or elaborate on their children's play behavior. So if parents are sort of interacting with their kids, if they encourage them, if they play with them, those children tend to reach language milestones sooner. So there seems to be some kind of relationship there with more interaction with your caretaker tends to improve your language performance. So all of these seem to be pretty good evidence that more interactions, more of that sort of positive reinforcement that comes from interacting with your caretakers can lead to better language outcomes. But we've already kind of hinted at the fact that this theory isn't the only thing that's going on. So things that we want to consider sort of as cons for this theory, the biggest one is that this theory of language can't explain that overwhelming and rapid development of human language that we talked about in early childhood. That explosive amount of learning where children are learning as many as 20 new words a day, that just can't be explained by environmental factors. That just can't be explained by interacting with their caretakers. So there must be something else going on. And to try and explain that sort of exception to this one theory, many researchers will claim that we are neurologically predisposed to develop language. Basically saying that we have innate abilities to acquire language, we have these predispositions that help us acquire language more quickly. So we have sort of built-in mechanisms that allow us to acquire language more quickly than we could if we weren't genetically predisposed. So this is kind of their way of saying that if learning alone isn't sufficient to explain how quickly we learn language, then there must be something else going on, and there's probably some kind of biological mechanism that's involved. And that actually brings us to our next theory, and this is Chomsky's nativist theory of language. So Chomsky is one of the most famous names when it comes to language acquisition. And his theory, and those in this nativist camp, had this idea that brains are evolved to produce language. So we have that innate predisposition to produce language. And in fact, nativism, the name that's associated with the theory, is the belief that certain abilities are built into our brains, that we're predisposed to do certain things. So a nativist theory of language is just saying that we are innately pre-programmed to acquire language. And so if they believe that we have this innate mechanism for acquiring language, of course, they want to know, what is that mechanism? Where is it? And so they named this mechanism for acquiring language the Language Acquisition Device, or LAD. So the LAD is a hypothetical mechanism that exists in our brain and would be responsible for facilitating our acquiring language. Now, although there is no single area that's been found that seems to serve this purpose, there is a substantial amount of evidence that biology and genetics in some combination constrain our language development. So one of the common and most notable examples is that we've long been regarded as the only species that has language. And that's another one of those contentious points up for debate. But Chomsky used this idea that humans and their language is unique to argue that there's clearly something distinguishing about how our brains have evolved to allow us to acquire language. One of the strongest pieces of evidence that points to the existence of some kind of mechanism that helps us acquire language is the fact that babies undergo a relatively slow period of acquisition when they're younger, but up until that age of, where we talked about 7 to 12 months, they sort of shift over into that really rapid acquisition period. And they acquire language very, very quickly. They acquire those words at an alarming rate up until about the age of 5. So that's, again, where we were talking about learning as many as 20 new words a day. So this range in early development, where they start picking up and acquiring these words very, very quickly, we can call this a critical period because it is necessary for children to receive different kinds of environmental stimulation in order to acquire language during this period. As evidence for these critical periods, we can look at congenitally deaf children, so children who are born deaf. If they receive a cochlear implant before the time they're 2 years of age, they're usually able to progress near normally on tests of language performance, and they consistently outperform those who receive those same implants after the age of 2. So it seems like 2 years old is some kind of a critical cutoff point where they need to be able to hear and be exposed to different sounds in order to acquire language sort of in the usual way. That being said, critical period implies that after you've passed that endpoint, that you're not able to learn anymore. But because it's still possible to learn language even after that early development, so those children who receive their implants after the age of 2, they can still process auditory sounds, they can still learn to speak, it's just not as effective. We might instead use this term sensitive period because it's more accurate. So we're more sensitive to learning languages and acquiring languages during that period. And then after that, it's more difficult to acquire a language, but it's not impossible. So we might say that throughout development, the neurological system that's responsible for language is more malleable early in development, but is still able to be modified later in life if we're given the proper environmental stimulation. If that idea of the sort of rapid, explosive acquisition of different words and that quick learning that happens early on in development isn't sufficient evidence for you to see this theory as a possibility, there are other pieces of evidence that Chomsky and other nativists have pointed to as supporting this idea of our language being something that is innate. So one of the biggest things, one of the sort of broad categories of evidence that they tend to use is the idea that similarities across the human species, so if we're seeing consistency between cultures, across different areas, in different languages, if the process of language development is consistent in all of those different scenarios, then it must be something that's genetically linked, something that's biological, as opposed to something that is environmentally or socially driven. And so there's a bunch of different interesting studies that have looked at things like this, but the big ones that we can point to are the fact that across different cultures, children tend to acquire nouns before verbs. Nouns, sort of objects, items, things, tend to be the first thing that they'll identify, and later on they learn verbs. And that's consistent no matter which language you speak, for the most part. We also see that the grammatical structure of language tends to be fairly consistent between cultures. We might have different orders and sort of different employments, but the fact that the rules tend to be fairly consistent across cultures gives us an idea that there must be some kind of underlying structure there that's involved. And we also see this default tendency for gestures. So if you're trying to get the point across by gesturing or pointing at, say, cards that have pictures on them, we tend to see that gestures follow the order of subject, object, verb. So who is doing the action? What are they doing the action with? And what is that action? That tends to be the standard order, even if the verbalization pattern that they would usually use follows a different order. So some languages will follow subject, verb, object instead. So the boy dumps water would be subject, verb, object. But even if that's how we would usually say that statement, if we were pointing it, we would point to the boy and then to the water and then indicate that he is dumping it. So gestures follow different rules than spoken language, sort of regardless of the order that our spoken language tends to use. So this is really interesting, and there's lots and lots of evidence looking at those gestures and the order of gestures across different situations. It's very cool literature to take a look at. But the last of the perspectives, or the last of the theories that I want to talk about, is the emergenist perspective. And this is sort of bridging the gap between the nativist and environmentalist or behavioral approaches. So this is basically saying that neither Chomsky nor Skinner were entirely correct, but that the reality is somewhere in between the two. So what we usually think of nowadays is that rather than that standard debate of whether it's nature or nurture, is it something that we learn or is it something innate, something genetic, we typically find that there's an interaction between our genetics and our environment and our social environment. So it's usually multiple factors that are involved. And in fact, the most agreed upon idea nowadays is that there are some innate predispositions towards learning language, and those predispositions are then shaped by our environment, by our experience. And so we end up with this combination of it's partially genetic, it's partially environmental and learned, it's partially controlled by social interactions, and it's a lot more complicated than any one of those other theories can sort of describe. So this is more in line with the theory that we currently operate with nowadays.